Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to MoonCon 24, the autumn edition. This edition is all about the fair folk. So hold on to your hats. Let's step into the fairy ring, although that's probably not advised. I'm sure our experts will tell you about that. MoonCon 24. It is produced and run by Moonbooks Publishing, and it will be presented by me, Rachel Patterson. We have some amazing fairy experts for you this evening with some fascinating talks. If you've got any questions throughout the event, do pop them in the comments and we will put them to our panel at the end of the event. We kick off in a minute. When I finish doing my waffling, basically, we'll kick off with Morgan Daimler, who has unfortunately not been able to be live with us for her talk this evening, but she has very kindly pre-recorded it for us. So we'll kick off in just a minute with Morgan's talk on Celtic fairies. Then we will be joined by the fabulous Daniela Simina, who has Romanian fairy expertise like you wouldn't believe. Fascinating stuff. Following on from that, we will have the very lovely Halo Quin with a talk about British fairies. And then we will all come together at the end with a panel to answer your questions and basically have a bun fight about fairies. So you just cannot miss that. It's going to be amazing. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Hopefully everybody has found us. We are streaming live to the Moonbooks Publishing Facebook page and also to the Moonbooks Publishing YouTube channel. Please comment if you feel you just want to say hello, if you've got any questions, if you've got any thoughts, insights, and I will literally throw them at the speakers at the end of the event. We are running for 3 hours continuously on this thread, so do please join us. It is on replay afterwards, but it's far more fun to be here live with us. So enjoy the presentations. Think of all those interesting questions, provoking questions that we can throw at them. And thank you, as always, to Moonbooks Publishing for supporting us authors and for basically putting this event on. So if my tech witchery doesn't escape me, I will hopefully manage to get Morgan's pre-recorded talk up for you. Still put your questions up if you've got any throughout it, and we will save them all for the end. But let's get Morgan up on the screen and I will catch you guys in half an hour or so.
This is Morgan Daimler. I have been an author with Moon Books for a little over a decade. I've written a variety of books, mostly about Irish mythology, witchcraft, and fairies. And I am here today as part of MoonCon 2024 talking about the Irish Aishi. So it's a little about who I am and why I'm going to be talking to you today. The Aishi, first of all, we kind of have to start with a little bit of a definition for who the Aishi are, what the term means, and I think this lays a good groundwork for a better understanding of the wider topic. So when we're talking about the Aishi, obviously this is a term from the Irish language. Aish is a word which you'll see spelled a couple ways. The modern version is A-O-S. The older version you'll also see sometimes as A-E-S. It can be pronounced anywhere from like ice to ace, depending on the dialect and which type of Irish we're talking about here. And it's a word that just means people. It tends to imply people of a more like noble status, important people, if you will, but it's generally just translated as people. She, S-I-D-H-E, is the spelling you're going to see the most often. That is the older archaic spelling, but it is used in modern sources as well. Oftentimes to differentiate, I think, from homophones in the Irish language, there's the modern spelling for this word would be S-I with a fada, an accent mark over it. And that word is also used for several other words. So people tend, from what I've seen, to often go with the older spelling in order to help differentiate and be clear that this is what they're talking about. The word she itself refers to the otherworldly hills or mounds. Sometimes you'll see them called fairy hills or fairy mounds that these beings are associated with. So, is she people of the otherworldly hills or mounds? You will also see, and this is sort of a slang that's come into effect in the last 20 or 30 years, people simply referring to these beings as the she. Now, properly, as we just established, in Irish, that would be talking about the place, the hills themselves. However, you do see it used sort of as a shorthand for the beings. And people don't always say a she or Athena she, which is another term that means people of the otherworldly hills. They'll just say the she, meaning the beings, the people. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Important, though, to kind of understand where the term is coming from, the language that it's coming from, and the way that it is used and can be used. This is often in English given as fairies. I personally try to avoid that as much as possible because it, I think, causes some confusion. When we hear the word fairy in English, we make a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of sort of preconceived notions, especially in popular culture, about who and what a fairy is that is very at odds with who and what the Irish ace she are. But again, just so everyone's aware, you will run across the term. You will see people referring to these beings as fairies interchangeably, including in Irish sources that are in the English language. So yes, it is a little bit confusing, but all important groundwork to kind of understand moving forward. So the reason I like to start with a definition, besides the fact that I just love semantics and I love the Irish language, is that I think it helps establish what the topic is, because it is a topic that causes so much confusion. So when we're talking about the Aishi, we're specifically talking about these beings that come from or exist in the other world, and through the she, the otherworldly hills or mounds, which act as entranceways or gateways or portals for these beings to travel back and forth between the human world and Ansel Ella, the other world, the world they come from. And in doing this, they are residents sort of both. And there's a lot of discussion and opinions and thoughts about the other world and what that is and how that relates to the human world. That would be a separate presentation, so we're not going to get into that here. But just important to keep in mind, there's really no set definitive understanding of this. There's just a variety of ideas and thoughts. And that is true for the Aishi as well. So when we do talk about them, and I mentioned we call them Aishi, I mentioned in English they're also called fairies. Both of those terms in some places are seen as things that you don't really want to say. You don't want to use those names because it could get their attention, which is not necessarily a good thing in all cases, or most cases. And also, particularly the term fairies in English, but also in some areas of Ireland, the term she as well. They're thought to be words that these beings don't like. They don't like being called this. They don't like these terms. They don't like it being applied to them. And they can become offended if they happen to be nearby or in the vicinity and hear you speaking about them. So what we find is a wide range of euphemisms. And the euphemisms also tell us a lot about these beings. Although it's important to understand the euphemisms are not generally meant to be descriptions, or they're not meant to actually be who and what these beings are. Euphemisms are used, they're a term that is intentionally particularly flattering or kind or something that would be seen as polite in order to both show that you're being respectful to them and also to kind of remind them that they're capable of being nice or good or friendly, which is not things that they necessarily always are when it comes to humans. So a lot of the euphemisms we see are things like, for example, I mentioned Athena is another term for them, the people of the fairy hills. That wouldn't be a euphemism, it's just another name. But a euphemism very similar to that is Athena and Athena means the good people or the good folk in English. Athena the noble people. You also sometimes see them referred to as Nahushla, which just means the gentry. Again, rough translations into English from the Irish. Athena Ella, the other people. In English, you'll also see them sometimes referred to as the other crowd. Themselves is a pretty common way they'll get referred to in Ireland, and that's becoming more popular elsewhere as well. So we see this range of terms, and there's many, many more. I'm just giving kind of a little sample here, all of which are meant to sort of remind these beings that they can be the good folk. They can be the shining ones. That maybe is a little more descriptive. They're the nobility, the gentry, flattering terms, so that if they happen to be around and hear these things being said, they will perceive you as being respectful, and they'll also be maybe flattered or pleased with the terms that you're using. So all of that kind of starts us on a picture of who and what these beings are. They are beings that exist in a separate reality or separate world, but have the ability to come into the human world and interact with us. They can potentially be helpful. They can also be harmful or dangerous. And we have a range of stories that sort of show both of these things happening. So they require our respect. And some of this is because when we talk about the Ishi, to be clear, it's a sort of a general term that encompasses a whole group or range of beings. Some of those beings are the Tuatha Dé Danann, the old Irish gods, who are thought to have gone into the Sidhe, gone into the otherworldly hills when humans first came to Ireland, and are now incorporated into and part of that population. We also have some references in mythology to the Horians. The Horians are sort of these chthonic, dangerous beings that predate the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland, the gods, and have interactions with them, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So in some sources, we see the Horians referenced as members of the Sidhe. We see them as this sort of third group in Irish mythology that isn't any of these main named god-associated groups. Not the Tuatha Dé Danann, it's not the Horians, it's not the Firbolg. It's this separate group of beings. In those cases, they're very associated with a particular deity named Manannán mac Lir. He is eventually incorporated into the Tuatha Dé Danann in stories, but in the oldest material, he is his own entity. He is referred to as a king of the otherworld, specifically the otherworld as it exists in a series of islands in the west and in the sea around Ireland. And he is sort of his own separate kingdom. And this is where the idea of the Aishi, the people of the Sidhe, kind of initially seems to be coming in. When the Tuatha Dé Danann go into the Sidhe after humans come to Ireland, it is Manannán, in one of the main stories about this, who teaches them how to live in the other world. He teaches them how to survive there, how to be immortal there. He teaches them how to pass invisibly in the human world so that they can continue to come and interact in Ireland, even though they are now no longer living in it in the same sense they had been previously. So Manannán is this very key figure, this key person who is the king of the otherworld and also the one who seems to understand it and the way it works and how to integrate new people into that. So we have this whole wide range of beings that fall into that third grouping, the Manannán grouping, that are not the Tuatha Dé Danann, not Horians. They are something different and something separate. And it's very important to understand all this, that there's layers to this. It's not a simple, straightforward subject. It's not something where we have one clear answer to, yes, this is who these beings are. And it's important to understand that because there are a lot of sources out there that will say simply that the Aishi are the Tuatha, that the Tuatha went into the Shi and became the Aishi, and that it's just a 1 = 1 situation. And a lot of this comes from material that started coming out in the late 19th century with the so-called the Celtic revival, the revival of Irish culture through sources like W.B. Yeats, A.E. Russell, Lady Gregory, Lady Wilde, people who were writing kind of around that time period. That prior to that, when we look at the older sources, when we look at the idea of who the Aishi were, they're really considered an entire huge population. They are potentially everywhere. They are invested in a lot of different places, these notable Shi, as well as there's trees that are associated with them. They used to be called fairy trees in Ireland. There's islands, there's different sorts of physical locations that are connected to these beings. And there's a whole range of ways that they can appear and manifest and interact with people, for positive and negative. They're described as existing in a culture that would have been very similar to Irish culture of the time, or slightly prior to the time. They would have a king or a queen. They would have a royal court. They would have knights and poets, but they would also have farmers and general warriors and, people who would take care of the cattle. And, in some of the references we find in mythology, there's references to, characters and stories who are members of the Shi who are, blind or can't walk, or, it's an entire societal range of people, is what I'm trying to get across here. It's not just the nobility. It's not just the Tuatha who went in as gods and sort of maintained this status quo and status. It is actually this entire society with a complete range of what you would expect in a human society for the different roles that are filled and the different people that you're going to find. And it's a huge wide range. And they were understood to be a multitude, just a huge number. There's one source, and this is, to be fair, I believe a 19th century source, but it talks about the Aishi as populous as flowers in a field, or, blades of grass in a meadow. This idea that they were a huge number of them and they were everywhere. But when this cultural revival happened, and the Tuatha in particular kind of were revived in the popular consciousness, and people started writing about the Aishi again, and by people I mean more like the aristocracy, the learned people, the folklorists, all of that class of people. They were writing about specifically the named beings, the members of the Tuatha that we were aware of, that are referenced still today, even in folklore. And what happened is this impression started to come across that there actually were not a huge number of them, that there were a limited number of them, and that they were mostly the more famous ones, the ones that were more remembered, more continued in stories. And so the whole perspective on them in the wider popular culture kind of started to move from this is a nation of beings, a multitude of beings, to this is a select group of beings. And that really changed kind of the wider way they were understood. Now, that's not to say you can't still find people who understand them as, as populous as the, rain falling from the sky, to use a different analogy. I don't want to keep picking on blades of grass. Not that you can't still find sources and people even today that will talk about them that way, as if they're just this huge multitude. But it definitely moved the needle on the way they were publicly perceived, so that they were narrowed down in many ways. And I hope that people can be more open-minded to the idea of this multitude of beings. One thing that I often talk about when we're talking about the Aishi is how do they look, how do they appear? And you have to keep that definition in mind in order to understand how wide the range is in their appearances. Now, we do have stories that talk about them looking very human, and the full range of human that you can imagine. We have some particular definitions that describe hair colors, blonde, red hair, dark hair, not as much with eye color. Eye color tends to most often be green. I don't know why. That just is how they tend to be in the mythology. We don't have a lot of descriptions in the myth to work with, but the ones that we do have. So beautiful, very human-like. But then we have other accounts where they're described as being, human in appearance, but only 2 or 3 feet tall. We have other accounts where they appear in different animal forms. Very human mentality, but in the form of an animal. And we have quite a few references to these beings as shapeshifters. The idea that their form is really at their own discretion. They can appear as they choose to appear. So gives you a lot of options for how you might see them or how they might be described, how they might be. We particularly tend to see them in stories in the more human interactions, particularly the mythology. But the folklore, we tend to see them described in a much wider range. There's an account of the fairy queen Una out in Galway, which talks about her appearing, trying to terrify someone. But she appears as this sort of amorphous, constantly shifting, like nightmare. And she can also appear in the form of a giant cow. In contrast, we see, for example, Mannanan in one of the main stories that he kind of features in. He features in a lot of stories because he's very popular, but one of the main stories that he features in, he encounters a human man. Mannanan is coming from the other world into the human world, and the human man is traveling out of the human world on this Imram, this sea voyage. And he tells the human man that he is currently in the form of a man for the purpose that he is going to Ireland to achieve. The implication there, however, is that this is not his true form or true appearance. It's just the shape he happens to be in for this purpose. So I think it's fairly safe to say that the majority of these beings are capable of changing their appearance and appearing however they choose to in any given situation. And that's something the folklore backs up. It talks about them being able to either physically change themselves, according to some sources, or according to other sources, able to affect the human mind in a way that it causes us to perceive them differently and in the way that they want to be perceived. So gives us an entire range of options with how you might see them. Now, I've mentioned a couple times the idea of them being around and maybe overhearing conversations. And I did mention when I was talking about Mannanan teaching the Tuatha how to live in the other world, that he taught them how to pass invisibly. This is actually a pretty important thing that we see across the whole range of belief and mythology. The idea that the Aishi and later the Tuatha once they have joined the Aishi, are able to be in the human world, but invisible or imperceptible to humans. And this is sort of a key factor of both belief and of who these beings are. They can potentially be around you at any time. You will not be aware they're there. You cannot see them or hear them. They are blocked from human perception, but they can be there. And we have several different stories in folklore that talk about people who were disrespectful, who were saying rude things, that they, didn't believe in the good folk and that they weren't concerned about them and weren't afraid of them and that the good folk didn't matter, and just, an array of insulting things. And of course, the good folk overhear this, and then of course, it does not go well for the human being after that because the good folk are offended. So the idea is always to try to speak respectfully because you don't know if they might be around. It's also why the idea of euphemisms is so important because you don't know for sure if they could be around. So on top of the various physical appearances that we do have for them, there's also this idea that they can be around and invisible. Now, I do want to be clear because this causes a lot of confusion today, and this is something that's coming in from an outside influence kind of over the last 100 years. But the idea that the good folk are intangible is really foreign to the Irish belief, at least. It was always believed that the good folk, that the Ishi, were physical beings. They could be physical in this world. They could physically interact with humans. They could physically interact with animals, the world, trees, rocks, whatever. In the same exact way that a human being might. They could simply be invisible, but they were not invisible because they were intangible. Those were two completely separate kind of concepts. And to kind of give an example of this, it's a very old folk tradition. If you're going to throw out water, particularly like dirty wash water, you would always yell a warning first so that if any of the good folk were passing by invisibly, you would not hit them with the dirty water, which of course would then offend them, which we don't want to do. But the implication there is clearly they were tangible enough, even if you couldn't see them, that they would be hit by this dirty water and be upset about it. Whereas if they were passing as, fully incorporeal spirits, that would be much less of an issue. So just something to keep in mind when we're talking about the good folk, when you're considering them, thinking about them, that you can have something be tangible and physical and also be invisible at the same time. It's not a contradiction in the folk belief. We today just kind of have this ingrained idea that they are incorporeal, but that's not something we find generally across the material. So I've kind of talked a lot about some of the history of who they are, connections that they have, ways they can appear. They are often associated with particular locations, which I touched on a little bit. There are very famous places that are known to be known to be these otherworldly hills. Nakshiana would be Una's. Nachme is Finvara's, also in Galway. Sheanbroga, Newgrange, is associated with the Ishi, particularly with Angus, and the Dagda, which are two of the two-headed Danann. But it was, at least at one point, understood to be one of the major Shi in the area. And there's also a multitude of smaller ones that are less famous, less well known, but can be found throughout the landscape. And I did mention the idea that there's also islands, there's other locations that are connected to the other world that sort of act as these passageways or anchor points, the fairy trees, the Kran Shi as well. And this can also give people the idea that these beings are kind of anchored into place, that they can only be found in these specific locations. But we have a whole range of stories that talk about them being able to travel, being able to move around and go different places. It's a fairly common belief in the folklore that at particular times of year, they would change their homes. So while we might associate these beings with one particular location and say this is their home, this particular Shi, that would be true, but they would also have another home. And at certain times of year, they would move from one to the other. And these times of year often are referenced as significant holidays. The fire festivals in Ireland, Bealtaine and Samhain, for example, are two of the main ones where the good folk are thought to be much more active, much more out in the world. You're much more likely to encounter them because this is a time when they're kind of traveling and moving around. So we want to be careful not to see them as too stationary, as too anchored to just one place. They are capable of going where they choose to go. That does not change the fact that they do have these home locations. Again, much like the invisible but corporeal thing, it's possible for both of these to be true at the same time. that they have particular locations that are strongly associated with them, but they also have the ability to travel and move around and go different places as they choose to. So a lot of the stories that we have come from interactions that humans have had when the good folk were traveling, when they were going from home to home, or they were going from one location to another for a particular purpose. It definitely is something that is seen as possible, and you're most likely to encounter them in these situations and in these circumstances. So I have to wrap up a little bit because I'm getting short on time, but I do want to mention that throughout all the history, going back into the mythology, into the folklore, into the modern accounts, there is a very strong idea of sort of an ingrained connection between humans and the good folk. And no one 100% understands why this is, or why it persists, or the nature of it, or any of that. But there's this idea that for whatever reason, we are prone to encountering them, and they are prone to encountering us. And often these interactions can either benefit both parties or have a negative consequence, usually more often for the human than for the Aishi, but can have a negative consequence. So we know, for example, we have a lot of stories, an entire body of stories about the idea that the good folk will take human beings, take living humans or sometimes deceased humans, and incorporate them into their number. Basically, if a human is kidnapped by the good folk have a way to transform that person into one of them. And at that point, then the human cannot leave. You cannot go and return to your own people, your own family. Once you have been turned into one of the Aishi, you kind of become limited to that reality. We don't have as many stories that go in the other direction, with members of the Aishi being coming human. We do have some folklore about that, though, so it is not entirely outside the range of possibilities. It just is something that is not emphasized as much as the other direction. Now, why this happens, again, there's a lot of theories. We don't know for certain. We just know that it does. We have a lot of stories where the good folk temporarily borrow someone, particularly a midwife or a musician, to fill a purpose that they need filled, but then the person gets to leave and gets to go on and continue living their human life after that. So they don't just take everybody. They don't just keep everybody, even people that they value, like musicians, they will let go again. So there's layers of mystery to this. And of course, I am trying to cover a lot of ground in a fairly short presentation for everyone. But I hope that this has at least piqued people's curiosity and provided a basic understanding of the Aishi, of who they are and sort of where they exist in belief. They do still exist in belief today. You can still find people talking about them and having encountered them. Not maybe as much as 100 years ago, but it is still there. It is still active folk belief. And just to quickly wrap up for everyone, if this is a subject that you're very interested in, obviously I myself have written about it, hence why I'm here giving this presentation. But you could also look up a website called Duchas.ie, DUCHAS.ie. It's the school's collection through Dublin College. It's a collection of a range of folklore and stories from the early 20th century. There is a treasure trove of material there on the Shi that you can dig into to get a kind of a wider understanding than what I can present in this short talk. You can look to the living folklore, people still in the culture who still have these beliefs. And there are quite a few good books on the market as well by Irish authors, as well as some good websites and social media sites by Irish authors. I do always encourage people to carefully vet those sorts of sources because there's also a lot of nonsense that's out there online. But there are some solid ones as well. Laura O'Brien's a good one. Anthony Murphy is a good one of Mythical Ireland. David Halpin's Circle Stories is a good source. And then there have recently been a range of books for more specific locations that are talking about these beings. So you certainly have ways you can move forward to learn more if the subject interests you, not just in an academic sense. You can apply this to your spirituality, to your own personal belief, even if you're just curious about it. You definitely have ways you can move forward. And as I said, I have written a book, Pagan Portals I She, which is specifically just about this topic. That also includes a whole list of references at the end. So if you end up getting that book, you can also go further from there. And I always encourage people to keep digging and to go further. So that wraps up our talk for today. I hope people feel like they got some sort of value out of this and are definitely walking away knowing maybe a little bit more about the topic than they did half an hour ago. I hope everyone has a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference and the other presentations.
Excellent. As always, fascinating. Morgan Daimler has so much information and knowledge. It is astounding. And obviously a huge range of books on fairy and other subjects as well, all available from Moon Books, of course. Now, for the rest of this evening, we have a couple of more speakers for you and then our panel. Again, if you have any comments, insights, thoughts, questions, do pop them in the comments and I will throw them at our panel later on. But waiting in the wings, we have the very lovely Daniela Simina, who is all about Romanian fairies, which are fascinating. And if you don't know anything about them, you're about to learn. So I'm going to welcome Daniela. Let's click all these buttons to make sure you can actually see us. There you go. Welcome, Daniela.
Hello, hello. I'm so glad to be here. I was very excited, anticipating for our autumn edition of MoonCon. So here I am, about to entertain you with stories about Romanian fairies.
Fantastic.
And
Do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself first, Daniela?
sure.
What you do?
I'd like to have a PowerPoint. Let's see if I'm tech savvy
More tech
enough
stuff.
to actually make it work. Share screen, yes. I select video or screen with no, not now. Come on, StreamYard to see your screen, yes.
Tech stuff.
Your browser has blocked your screen. How great. Okay, I think we'll go without the
You're right, sure. Oh, we've lost it completely now. It's fairies, isn't it? You talk about fairies and everything goes. We should have known better, really, than to talk about it. There's a question there about book on fair North America. Morgan Daimler has a new book coming out on fairies from North America, which is just amazing to have that knowledge about certain particular areas. I had no idea. We'll hopefully there's let's welcome Daniela.
I'm back.
Hello.
Okay.
It's fairies. You talk about fairies and
Take
technology.
Take two. So yes, we'll go without the PowerPoint. I think that's the safest way to make it. No problem.
Okay.
To make it through this presentation. So about myself, well, if you really need to see fairies, I have like a display there of little house fairies in the back. So I'm Daniela Simina. I come from Romania, where I grew up with my grandmother, who was a medicine woman and a fairy seer. And this probably needs a little bit of explaining. What is the difference and what's the overlap between being a medicine woman and being a fairy seer? So being a medicine woman, obviously she did what folk medicine people would do in terms of providing healing, advice about using herbs, about dealing with less than friendly kind of spirits, propitiating luck, abundance. But not all medicine people in Romania are fairy seers. So fairy seers are actually a very small category of people who interact with fairy beings, which we're going to discuss and describe and enjoy learning about in the next half an hour.
Excellent.
And so she was one of those people who interacted with fairy beings, receiving knowledge from them, but also sometimes like tangible, very tangible gifts. So experiencing them in a very corporeal manner as well, not only as spirit or very refined, let's put it this way, very refined from a material physicality point of view. So that's who I am. And my research and all the work that I've been doing came for two reasons. Once, growing up with these things, they're natural, they came naturally. And then it hit me that not everybody around me, especially as a child, I realized that not everybody around me was having the same experiences. And I started to question, am I odd? Is it something off with me? Why people do not talk about it? And then the other reason was I needed to explain, gain a better understanding of my own experiences, not through the eyes of a child, because as a child, you don't really need any explanations. You just go for it. It is what it is. But then when you grow up and other people have questions, you want to be able to answer. And in answering those, also gain more insight about what I was dealing with, what I had experienced, and what's the usefulness of it ultimately. So that got me into researching and reading and learning and experiencing in person, experimenting in person with folk traditions of other cultures outside Romania.
Right.
So my own path led me to writing this, a fairy path, the memoirs of a young fairy seer in training. So that's me growing up. And there's actually descriptions of rituals and practices as I saw them done or participated in them as a kid alongside my grandmother, but also alongside other fairy seers.
Fantastic.
And my research led me to Irish fairy traditions, and I was like blown away, awestruck by how many parallels, both similarities and differences, but nevertheless parallels. And then, you know what they say, write the book you wish
to read.
you wish to read, you wish to.
Absolutely.
So also from this parallelism and this research that I engaged with for a long time, I realized the need to know how to use herbs, plant material, in a way that, especially if you're in a more eclectic type of practice, which happens for two reasons. One, fairy themselves are not a stagnant, stationary fixture in a cultural landscape or geographical landscape. They do migrate, they move along with traveling, migrating populations. So you're likely, even if you live in the US, you are likely to encounter fairy beings, let's say from Irish culture. Read Morgan Daimler's work on this topic. Fairies in North America and fairy, the other worlds, by many other names. So that's that. And then we are also, when we move, we settle on lands that obviously there were beings there before us. So it is important to know how to treat your allies, the ones who are more benevolent,
absolutely.
and how to keep away the ones that you don't really have affinities with, or they don't have affinities for you. So in using plant materials, this becomes really important. What is apotropaic and what is propitiatory? So this is, and how
I'm going to leave you to explain that, Daniela, because I could talk to you for hours, but people want to know all about you and your subject. So
that's me.
I am going to hand over to you so that you can explain it all to everyone, and I will catch up with you in a bit. So have fun with it.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's get into the specific, delve into the specific topic of Romanian fairies. Apologies for not having a PowerPoint, but technology, not my forte really. So now that I gave a little bit of an overview about myself, I will give an overview of fairies, the concepts of fairies in Romania. And we don't really have time to go into every single type of fairy being that Romanian folklore and tradition has, but we'll surely cover what is most important, what is most significant and most widely acknowledged even today, to this day. Fairies in Romania, we have the word zone to describe them in general. Depending on what part of the country you are in, the word zone is used liberally, or they would be referred as ele, which is the third person, like they or themselves. And I found this to be common also in Irish fairy lore, where you're trying to use euphemisms or using expressions, words that don't point directly toward, hey, fairy. Because that's, you never know, in Romania, this holds true as well. You never know when they are around. They can make themselves invisible. And as the lore and folklore has it, in Romania, they can be very corporeal, to the point where a person, a human person interacting with them, wouldn't know that they're actually in the presence of a fairy being until something happens and give the other away as a fairy being. So zone or ele, that would be generic. However, within this, so this is fairy, don't expect things to be neatly labeled and categorized, because that's not the case. So there is also the understanding that there is a category within these beings, within the spectrum of beings, that refer to as zone or sunziene, and they are benevolent. They are markedly benevolent toward humans, and they mingle with human communities, celebrating particular agricultural. So in the time when the calendar, the agrarian calendar, was very important, and the shift from one season to another was celebrated with bonfires and feasts where people would join together. So that was a time, and in places where these things still happen in Romania, this is the time when fairies will also mingle with the partying crowds. So for Sunziene in particular, their holiday is known as the Night of Sunziene and the Day of Sunziene, which is midsummer. And at this time, it is said that the fairy queen Sunziana flies with her retinue over fields or move over fields, and in passing they would bless crops, they would bless plants and herbs to be used for medicinal and magical purposes afterwards. And the best moment to harvest these would be the plants for medical and medicinal uses. I mean, the best moment to harvest these would be the morning of June 24th, so the morning following the night of Sunziene. Now, what is important? Notice that we all know, or most of us know, that midsummer is associated with St. John, and you have St. John holiday and Mass said in church for St. John. While Mass is still said in church for St. John in Romania on midsummer, the name of the holiday primarily, and this is how it is recorded in the church calendar, is Sunziene, the feast of Sunziene, which tells us that these beings, these fairy beings, were so important to the culture, to the people, that they were mentioned and preserved even in the church calendar. So not even the church itself erased it and replaced it as it happened in so many other places. Their name was not replaced with that of the saint holiday. So needless to say, the night of Sanziana was celebrated, and still to the day in some areas is celebrated with bonfires and feasting. There is a lot of love magic and divination done, and in all these practices the help of Sanziana is invited, asked for. Which takes me to the next point. People make offerings to the fairy beings, to the Sanziana. Another parallel with Irish folklore, but also with Scandinavian folklore and traditions surrounding fairy beings, the Alfar over there. So what are these offerings about? First of all, there are places deemed special to the fairies, to the Sanziana themselves and to their queen. And these places are sometimes near waters, bodies of water, like rivers or lakes, near crossroads, or special trees, specific trees. And they have an affinity for the pear tree. Sometimes it's an apple tree, but for the vast majority of cases and stories that I read in the lore, in the folklore, or even fairy tales, that have incorporated a lot of the traditional folklore, pear trees feature like most prominently in association with fairy beings. Offerings are left for them, for the Sanziana, and more generically for fairies, offerings are left also on May Day. And these offerings are presented on a white tablecloth. The offerings are usually white items like white bread or eggs, hard-boiled eggs, cheese, dairy products. And they say a white hen would be cooked. Obviously, pluck the feathers, but that's originally a white hen that's being cooked. And people would sit down and have like picnics in these places, but then a portion would be made, like a platter would be made with bits and pieces from all the dishes being served, and that's left aside for the fairies. And there was the custom, if a stranger would be seen in passing. Now, bear in mind, I'm talking about many, many years ago when communities were small and everybody knew everybody. So seeing a stranger appearing out of the blue and passing by while you are offering to the fairies on a day that is a fairy holiday, that could mean that you are actually seeing a fairy being passing by. So it was the custom to invite a stranger because in relationship with fairies, with the Zune, I'm talking about the bright luminous ones still, interacting in positive manner, being courteous, being smart, but not like in a way, not like cocky kind of smart, being polite, showing that you have courage, you have character, always earned their sympathy and their benevolence, and whoever is in their good graces also receives gifts from them. This is how many Pharisees have received their gifts of doing healing or receiving messages or knowledge from the fairies themselves, Sanziana in particular in this case. So aside from Sanziana, which are the bright ones, we also have the not so bright ones, the dark ones, and they are known as Rusali. And the Rusali, their feast, and again, the church calendar records it as the feast of Rusali, and it's Pentecost. So 40 days after Easter, you have Rusali coming. And Rusali are known to be very dangerous. So people are advised, strongly advised, to stay away, don't come out after dark. Stay away from the places that typically are known to be the favorite gathering spaces for Rusali. Sometimes just crossing paths with them, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could bring about their wrath. And it was said that people could get maimed, driven mad, like insanity, or killed just by running into them when they didn't wish to be seen. They are also connected to the dead and the ancestors. And I know it seems like a paradox here because the ancestors are the ones whom we look at as benevolent, people who have their back, people who are always there for us to advise and protect and give knowledge. So this is not absent entirely from the picture when we're talking about the Rusali, who are also known to be great healers and teachers of healing arts. Their affinity is to teach mostly male practitioners. And there is a group of ritual dancers, they're known as Kalushari, and they dance around the time surrounding Pentecost, the holidays. Their dance occurs with blessings from the fairy queen Rusalia. And those places where they dance, they go and dance in the main plaza in the village. They may go and dance in like households where the courtyard is big enough to accommodate its whole pretty big scale ritual. And people will come from all over the village, all over the community to witness the dance. Small children are brought and handed over to the dancers who are carrying them around, not during the dance, but right after, carrying them around. So it is said those children will be blessed by the Rusali, so they go not necessarily under their protection, but they will be on their good side. And they're also grow up very vigorous and strong. The dance of Kalushar, it imitates flying, so it's very acrobatic. Men jumping really high up into the air. So it does emulate the flight, the aspect of moving through the air. So there is also the custom of bringing people who are sick, and this is another paradox here. Ailments caused by Rusali themselves, the Yela themselves, or other types of fairies. So these people believed to be afflicted with fairy types of disease, they're brought within the circle, and the Kalusharis will dance around them, which I heard stories. I never witnessed this in person, but I heard about stories where people felt significantly better up to the point of regaining their ability to stand and walk after being like paralyzed for a while. So it is indeed a very powerful healing ritual. Rusali, as I said, they have their feast day on Pentecost, and there's like a whole week surrounding that time when they're being like the most active, and also offerings are being presented to them. Offerings to them are presented in conjunction with offerings to the ancestors, which is customary in Romania still. Offerings to the ancestors are being made directly at the graveyard, at the cemetery. So at service being said, and then offerings presented. Very beautiful syncretic blend of Christian custom, that of blessing with using Christian prayer to bless the offerings, and then and the ancestors, and then also incorporating this aspect of the Rusali partaking from the offerings themselves. So another figure that is, so we have, backtracking a little bit, We have here fairies that move in groups, like trooping fairies, but also solitary figures. And the among the trooping fairies, there are also divisions. Some protect a specific community, specific village, the land, and the other group may protect a different community. Here is not a division between like Senziana and Rusali. There is nowhere I could find a division. I mean, naming what kind of fairies would protect a community and what kind of fairies would protect another. So there's a general agreement that there are way more fairies beyond Rusali and Senziana and another one that we'll discuss shortly. So outside there are many other kinds. Some of them come from the very the geography, the landscape itself. Some of them are actually land spirits. Also, tradition incorporates them along fairies, more general way. So going back to the idea that there are communities of fairies protecting specific communities of people, this means that for one person, being in the good graces of a group of fairies could automatically put you on the blacklist of the other group. So again, the importance of propitiatory and apotropic herbs and other practices. How do you use them to keep your allies close, and making sure that the other ones, they're not offended, but they're not invited into your spaces close to your person either. So a third group of fairies that I would like to mention, I guess everybody's wondering, okay, there's just ladies, women presenting fairies. Do we have any male presenting fairies? And the answer is yes. And they're called Santuadari. And the name has changed, Tuadar, Santuadar. So it has connections to an ancient deity that had to do with horses, farm animals in general, but horses in particular. And Santuadari are understood in two ways. One, the fairy beings that look like, centaurs, half horse, half person. And they are said to be, again, avoided. Their holiday is earlier in the year, is prior to actually that of Rusali. That's when they go around, and they are outright hostile to people, regardless of gender, but with a little bit more of an inclination of being hostile toward women. Apologies for the gendered language that I use, but this is how folklore in Romania was recorded, so really gendered. So please translate whatever I'm saying in the way that makes sense toward any kind of gender denomination. So when I say men, I mean male presenting. When I say woman, it's female presenting. And I'm trying to maintain a balance in between how these would translate for us today and the way they are recorded in the folklore. So these beings, the Santuadari, are averse to female presenting human beings. Therefore, these people are advised to stay indoors after the dark. However, because this is fairy, nothing's clear cut, black and white when it comes to fairy beings, they are benevolent and very helpful toward girls of marriageable age. If you go back in time, at the point when marriage was essential, was like a lifeline for a woman, then we understand the importance of Santuadari's gifts. There was a time when women have no future except that of having a family, having a husband, and the children to support her in old age. So that was very important and something very much sought by young women in a rural area. So at Santuadar, there was a ritual where young ladies of marriageable age, young girls, would go during the nighttime on top of the hill, and there were elderly people also guarding, and they would invite, the elderly would invite the Santuadar, would make offerings to them, and then the girls would sing a specific song in which they invite the Santuadar to give them like beautiful hair, like the horses' manes, and to give beautiful hair. So, and to give them beauty and vigor, and to give them the chance to find good husbands. And then they would leave the offerings and go back home. Now, around this time of the of the holiday, the day prior, the morning after, people would cut their hair, would snip their hair. I remember my grandmother clipping my hair, and whoever had farm animals, clipping manes and tails, and ask Santuadar to actually make it beautiful, make it more beautiful. So that's about Santuadar. Notice the ambivalence, notice the dark, but also it's never dark. That's also a good side to it. Same as Sinziana, they're all bright and shiny and beautiful. But if angered, if crossed, if offended in any way, they would turn as aggressive and dangerous as the Yele, as aggressive and dangerous, and as the Santuadar. And in conjunction with Santuadar, part of the celebration is men getting dressed as the Santuadar and shedding their shoes in iron. The Santuadar, the centaurus beings, are said to have their feet shod in iron, and as they're trotting, they make this sound that send people indoors. And young men will play pranks by shedding their feet, their shoes in iron, and then trotting around the neighborhood, like scaring everybody, and playing all kind of pranks. Sometimes, simply just mischief, but sometimes on the more aggressive kind. So these are like the three major beings. As solitary beings, I cannot forego not mentioning a fairy person who is very, very similar to the Baba Yaga, much known from the Slavic folklore. We have a similar figure in Romanian folklore. Her name is Muma Paduri. We can have a whole presentation on how to say these names in Romanian, maybe for another time. It means the mother of the old woods. So the mother of the old woods, she's bestower of knowledge. She initiates many people into the art of healing, but she's also utterly dangerous. She is known, a parallel here with the Irish changelings. She's known to kidnap young babies, and there are ways to bring them back. There are ways to notice when this kidnapping is about to happen, and then what to do to prevent it from happening, to keep the being away. And I have described the ritual. So again, right here, I had described like a whole experience. I was present to that. I was, I believe, 9.5, 10 years old, and my grandmother and another lady were called like in the middle of the night to take care of a situation where it was obvious somebody, and of course, the old woman of the woods is the prime suspect, was trying to take a child away. So they brought the ladies in, and they prepared like a whole ritual for sending her away, and also then protecting the whole family. And it was really scary. So after that, my grandmother asked me, "Hey, are you still interested to be a fairy seer?" And I said yes, but I think it was more due to my pride than to actually what was in my heart. Because given the chance, I would have run away. Given a chance to, save face, and also run away, I would have run away. So she's a shapeshifter. The Mumapaduri, she can appear as a beautiful young lady, the seductress. She also, I mean, she acts as the seductress. She's not just beautiful. She guides the hero, the protagonist, in stories, both fairy tales and folklore. She guides the protagonist through different challenges. And the other way around, she appears as this fearsome, very disfigured looking, with parts human, parts, she looks like a contorted tree, or with patches of bark instead of skin. So she can appear like that, and then guiding the protagonist through a number of challenges, at the end of which he will either be greatly rewarded or killed point blank. And as I said, Romanian fairy landscape is very complex, very complicated to navigate, and it is good to know, either if you're just pure curiosity, intellectually interested to know more about it, or you want it for your own spiritual practice. I do, short parenthesis, brief parenthesis here, I don't believe that fairies are fixtures in the landscape. Okay, some are. A spirit of the mountain is a spirit of the mountain. But the fairy beings that we're talking about here are not set fixtures in the landscape. They can travel, they can move around with human communities, or they can be contacted, propitiated to draw near if one wishes to do so. Not commanding, but again, propitiating. Commanding, never, not that I'm aware of, never turns out well for the human trying to do the coercion part, commanding part. So for all those interested, I would recommend, I had like a whole slide with resources, but you can surely contact me on the social media. I'm present on Facebook as Daniela Simina author page, so you can ask me there, and I would gladly post the list of resources that I had for her for this presentation. I will post it over there, so you can learn all that you need to learn, to know about Romanian fairy lore. And the resources that I have there are obviously translated in English, so you do not have to undertake the additional task of learning Romanian in order to learn about fairy beings. And I think I'm done presenting. I'm not really sure how I am on time, but this is what I had to speak about today.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. You finished early, which must be a record, I think.
Wow, I'm notorious for going past time, but because of that interruption, I wasn't exactly aware where am I. So I'm like,
we're flexible.
Yeah, better wrap it up than go over time.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you to Daniela, and her books are all available from all the usual sources. You're going to leave us now for a very short while. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you so much.
And we will see you in a bit.
Yes, of course.
And now we have the very, very lovely Halo Quin waiting in the wings. So I'm going to add it to the screen. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Fairies have already been messing about with technology, so fingers crossed.
This is why I sent you a backup option earlier.
Yeah.
Like,
we should know, shouldn't we? We should know never to trust fairies and technology. Yeah, big offerings to the fairies after this, if they keep it going. So welcome, Helen Quin. Thank you very much for joining us. Would you like to just tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Well, the short version is that I am an author at Moon Books, obviously. And actually my first book with you was a book on working with fairy magic, and was very much rooted in my practice as someone who started out in witchcraft and paganism, like self-taught, at like age 10, 11. And prior to that, I had always been fascinated by fairies because I could feel them.
Right.
I was like, I can feel these spirits here. And so when I finally found paganism and other people talking about actual magic, like adults talking about magic and as a like, this is real, I was like, oh good, I'm not mad. I don't have to give this up to grow up. I can, you know, keep on with that. So like I'm a storyteller, I'm a philosopher, so that informs a lot of my approach to learning and sharing and speaking about things. I'm always interested in how we weave the threads together, where we find the contradictions and the paradoxes, and where we find the similarities, and how, like, what is the potential truth, not that there is ever one whole truth that explains everything when it comes to fairies or most of the world. But like trying to look for that, like what happens when we bring these together and what kind of things come out of that. And yeah, so that's me. I'm a storyteller, a philosopher, and a witch.
That's a pretty good summing up. So I shall disappear off the screen and leave you to do your talk and catch up with you for the panel afterwards. So have fun with it.
Thank you. Well, it's been an absolute delight to listen to Morgan Daimler and Daniela Simina. I'm not sure I'm saying your name correctly. I apologize, Daniela. To listening to your talks, and I'm delighted to be able to share a little bit about British fairy. So British, it's a little bit of a tricky term if you are in any way, shape or form related to or living on the British Isles, because there's all sorts of political things, but I'm going for that term in order to talk about this island on which I live. So that includes England, Scotland, and Wales. Okay, and that's the terminology. That's what Britain refers to as England, Wales, Scotland. That particular island. Though of course the movement of the people over the millennia in and on this island and the borders of those particular areas have shifted and changed. So in ancient Britain, there were many tribes and several waves of migration, including the Angles and Saxons, who at one point we thought invaded violently, but at this point historians are saying actually came and settled more peacefully, and then before then the Norman invasion. So we've had these waves of people coming onto this island. So it's long been an island of many people and a melting pot of cultural exchange. In terms of myth and legend, obviously as a storyteller, that's one of the roots for me in finding those threads on ancient belief and fairy belief. In terms of myth and legend, the countries we now call Scotland and Wales share many threads, as the people who live there once upon a time, it was much more connected. And so we find figures like Merlin before King Arthur was mentioned in the legends of both Scotland and Wales. Merlin. Scotland and Ireland obviously have many connections as well, and I'm not going to be talking about Irish fairy because I don't need to, but also because that's not where my roots are, where my understanding is. But there's many connections between this island and the island of Ireland, and this can be seen in the way the languages connect up. So in Wales, Cymraeg, Welsh, is described as a P-Celtic language, and the Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic are described as a Q-Celtic. Please don't ask me to explain what that means beyond the fact that the Scottish and Irish languages share a much closer root, and then the Welsh is closer to Cornish and Breton. So you're seeing kind of, I'm hoping you're seeing there's kind of overlaps between these cultures, but also there's evidently from the fact that we've got the Scottish language and Scottish people, the Welsh people, the English people, there is a certain amount of differentiation in the identity. You may be able to tell from my accent that I am English, and I grew up in the southwest of England, not too far from Avebury, which is a nice way of describing the landscape that I grew up in. I grew up in a large town named Swindon, which it doesn't have much to recommend it except for its location. And it is, as I say, very near to Avebury in these beautiful, beautiful countryside. And I moved further west into Wales almost 20 years ago. So I want to share a little bit about that so that you can tell where my perspective on the fair folk of this landscape comes from. I was fascinated, as I said, by fairies from a very young age, and not just because they were depicted as beautiful, free beings of magic, but because I could feel their presence in the world around me. From our tiny garden in Swindon, we had trees in that tiny patch of land that whispered to me and that showed me the patterns in the stars and the interconnectedness there. And a short walk away from where I grew up was a wild stream, a river, and fields in which I could play, even though I lived in the centre of a town. I remember crawling into the hedges and looking for fairies and sensing a shimmer and a presence, and feeling that also sometimes when I walked through the streets in the town itself, in those places where people don't necessarily expect to find those beings. As I grew up, I discovered folk tales and modern witchcraft, or cunningcraft, depending on where in the history you want to pick the language from, which I tend to describe as a practice of magic that involves liaising with the spirits around you, the beings around you, being in relationship with this world and the other world, which is not so far away as it turns out. So I began following those threads and swiftly discovered that there were mixed messages around these spirits that I'd known since I was young. They had always felt friendly to me, if wild and thus worthy of caution. But in Britain, the fairies, as we've heard in Ireland, in Romania, as much as they are spoken about, they are both said to be mischievous tricksters and helpful sprites. They're said to hide precious things, but also to reveal lost objects. They are known to be able to help with the housework, but also punish laziness and cause havoc. They might lead you into the marshes to drown, or grant you the ability to play music, which will enchant the hardest of hearts. They are tall, regal, shining lords and ladies, and they are twisted, crooked, muddy creatures of the woodland. So who are they? Now, historically, we can look at their evolution, and there are some wonderful books that explore this. Recently, I was reading Ron Hutton's Queens of the Wild, and the chapter in there on the Fairy Queen, and he explores the historical root of the Queen of the Fairies and illuminates the earliest uses of the word fae to simply mean a magical person, and originally to mean a magical act, or the activity of working magic, or something uncanny. It was a verb, so it then became applied to people who were magical. For example, Morgan Le Fay was not necessarily being described as a being from the other world, but rather as a woman with magic who did magical things. The term fae, as you may have heard, may be related to the idea of fate, possibly converging or coming out of the Latin fata. But in medieval Britain, fae was a verb, meaning the activity of working magic. Prior to that point, the term for magical beings that we now consider to be the fair folk was actually the Anglo-Saxon elves. And if you remember, I mentioned that they came and they settled, and they brought that Scandinavian, Norse, those traditions of northern Europe, and the term elf from the Scandinavian and Norse term alvar and those related terms. But from the 15th century, the term fairies was well established. So there are a lot of similarities between Scandinavian elf lore and the fairy beliefs throughout Britain. You can find outlines of and comparisons of this, but I won't go into it here. One good reference is Jenny Blaine's book, Whites and Ancestors, Heathenry in a Living Landscape. It's a nice little pocket-sized book which you can dip into and get an idea of that. So there's a strong suggestion that the Anglos and Saxons brought their elf lore over to Britain when they settled here. But I would suggest that it has continued to inform fairy faith in Britain because of the similarities between the spirits of their landscape and ours. Perhaps because the ocean and the country borders that separate us are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. Interestingly, as Daniela was talking about the bright shining fae and the dark fae, we also find the light elves and the dark elves, the Ljós Alfar and the Svart Alfar, in the Scandinavian traditions and the Norse traditions, though the dark elves were more closely related to dwarves, and while not necessarily friendly, weren't considered to be wicked, but rather of under the earth. So there's an interesting parallel but difference there. So we've got lots of language in Britain for the fair folk, and as we've heard from our other speakers, we would often use euphemisms, the fair folk, coming out of that terminology of fae, which became fairies, which became, but also the good people, the good neighbours. In Welsh, the Tywydd Teg, or the mother, which is the fair family, or they also know them as the mother's blessing. So there are all those euphemisms here as well. But the term fairy has come to incorporate a broad spectrum of beings that nowadays thought of as non-human rather than that fae magical person, but still similar to us in some way. Now, given the wide range of descriptions one might find in a fairy encyclopedia, I don't believe that this similarity is an aesthetic one or an appearance one. It's not that we're the same kind of being, because people have identified a family resemblance between the Kelpie and the courtly fairy queens. Rather, I'd pinpoint this similarity, like they are not human, but they're somehow similar to us, as being that they are related to the same world that we are, the natural world, but the part of it that we might gloss as the undomesticated or the wild, the untamed, to a degree. Just as there are a wide variety of animals, of mammals, there are a wide variety of fairies. And there's that connection to that shared environment, shared landscape. Now, they're known to live in fairyland or Elfheim, and to visit our realm. But the lines between those two spaces, the other world and this world, are so blurred. We can find in the stories of humans traveling into fairy mounds, they will find members of their community that have died there, ancestors there, there are connections there. We'll also find stories of people stumbling through portals or stumbling through into the other world just by passing through the mists. There's such a closeness in these two places. In the first branch of y Mabinogi, in the Welsh legends, we find Pwyll goes hunting in the woods and finds himself encountering around the king of the other world, the king of Annwn or Annwfn, that he is, in our parlance, the way we describe him today would be a fairy king. He is an otherworldly king, a magical being. And that line between when those two meet is very blurred. When Pwyll goes into the other world, then it is very similar to ours. It is very close to ours. There's no great gateway that he goes through. When later Rhiannon comes out of the other world into ours, it's through the mists. It's through that liminal space at dawn, but not near a magical mound. You see the mound again, but it's not an entirely separate location somehow. These places are so close that the borders are maybe not as strong as we think in our modern way of saying this world and that world are different. So in the edge between Scotland and England, we get the borders, and that particular line is less of a line and more of an area. Throughout history, there's this space, depending on the fighting and what have you that was going on. There's this area that's known as the borders, and we've got the border ballads, which include there are two very famous tales, border ballads, that feature a fairy queen and a mortal human. And I like these two for illustrating some really interesting points about the fair folk. So both of the fairy queens ride horses and move between the worlds. Both take a human with them. In Tam Lin, the story goes, Janet, a mortal human, goes into the woods where she's not supposed to go, and she meets a fairy man in the woods. And she gets pregnant through the usual activity, and then goes back to ask him who he was. And it turns out he wasn't a fairy at all, but a mortal knight who was stolen from the human realm when he fell from his horse. He's lived happily for 7 years in fairyland, in Elfheim, but he's scared because he's heard that every 7 years the fair folk pay a tithe to hell. And he says, I am so fair and full of flesh, I fear 'twill be myself. And so he asks Janet to help him escape. At the crossroads on All Hallows Eve, she waits, hidden in the darkness, for the fairies to ride by, for the horses to ride by. And when his horse goes by, she pulls him down and holds him tight. And the queen turns him into all sorts of monstrous beasts, into a hot iron poker that burns her flesh, into a lion roaring, into a bear with great claws, into a snake that tries to bite her, and in the end, into a naked knight who she wraps in her cloak and hides away. At which point the queen herself is furious and says, if I'd have known what would happen tonight, Tam Lin, I'd have plucked out both thine eyes and turned thy heart to stone. In Thomas the Rhymer, that other very famous border ballad featuring a fairy queen turning up and taking a mortal man into fairyland, he has fallen asleep under a single tree by the river and is woken to the sight of a beautiful lady on a white horse, and she invites him to come and serve her for 7 years in her land. Says, if you give me a kiss, then sure of your body I shall be. Thomas says yes. He goes with her to her land and he serves her for 7 years. And here he is given on the way there a rule to follow. You shall not speak of anything that you see or hear, shall not make a sound, make a word, or you'll never get home. And so Thomas manages to keep to his agreement. Thomas manages to serve silently for 7 years. And in the romances, in the story that this ballad grew out of, we are told somewhat of what he may have seen there and why he may have needed to hold his tongue. And it is sure enough to do with sexuality. But he is returned after 7 years with the gift of prophecy, or rather the tongue that cannot lie, which at first he tries to reject, but she insists. And Thomas the Rhymer, Thomas of Ercildoune, was known to be a real human being, a historical figure in the borderlands of Scotland, in that area. And you can actually go and visit that landscape where that meeting happened. And it's said that a few years later he just disappeared, and many people thought that he returned to his beloved queen. So in these ballads that rose out of the Romance tradition, out of that fairy folklore that was in the land, that was being woven into these stories, we see that people recognized those beings as very similar to humans, similar enough that a magical human might be mistaken for a being of the other world, as Tam Lin was by Janet, and that certain fair folk might have sexual relationships with certain humans, as the queens did with, or as Thomas's queen did, and perhaps Tam Lin's queen did, and that they could be physical, tangible. So these ballads also give us a clear glimpse of some of the patterns of engagement. In both cases, the time in Elfland was limited to 7 years, which is a magical number. In both cases, there are rules. In one, the mortal breaks the rules and then has to escape, having slept with a human woman, and is threatened. In the other, the mortal follows the rules, remains faithful, and is rewarded. So the pattern of keeping to that agreement is played out again also in the Welsh tale of Llyn van Fach, the physicians of Muddfai. Now there are quite a few tales of fairy ladies from the lakes, the ladies of the lake. And in this particular story, this one's really famous because it gave rise to the physicians of Muddfai. So in this story, a shepherd lad is eating his lunch by the side of a lake, and a woman, an otherworldly woman, emerges. He woos her, there's some exchange of bread, and he has to get the baking just right. And they marry on the condition that he does not strike her. Some say he does not strike her at all, and some say that he does not strike her 3 times. Now, they have children, and she brings with her many, many beings from the other worlds that make them quite wealthy and well off and comfortable, and they live very happily. She's a little bit odd. They go to a wedding, and she's somewhat disinterested because, well, you know, okay, it's a wedding. She goes to a funeral and is laughing because the person's suffering has ended. She goes to a christening and cries when it should be a joyous occasion, for that baby has a hard life ahead of them. So she's a little bit strange compared to the customs of the people that she's now living with him. But as is so often the way, he does end up striking her in ways that he didn't expect to fulfill that. He taps her on the shoulder with his gloves. He catches her with a stirrup, with a bridle. And she does leave him back into the lake, taking with her all of the fairy creatures that came as part of her dowry and their children. But she leaves behind her sons. And while her husband, the young shepherd, now all grown, never sees her again, it is said that she comes back and teaches her children the fairy lore, the healing magic, the uses of herbs, and how to use charms to become great healers. And they are known as the ancestors of the physicians of Muddfai, the doctors of this town, this little village in the south of Wales, Muddfai, near a lake on the top of a mountain. And we even have their charms and their herbal medicines written down, because it was written in Welsh and Cymraeg, it was often passed over in favour of the writings in Anglo-Saxon, in Latin, in the more fashionable languages. So it's only been in relatively recent years that some of that information has started to become recognized, showing us the native magical herbal medicine of this landscape, of this place, rather than importing in ginger from other places and exotic herbs and spices like a lot of our medicine, our herbalist medicine would talk about doing. It had one of those strands of the native herbs, which is an interesting thing when we reflect back on that connection with it coming from the fair folk. So creating an agreement or a compact with spirits is a very old practice. which we can also find in the grimoire tradition. In King Solomon's tale, it's a good example where he makes a deal with the demons, the spirits, to build his magical temple, and so on. This method of making magic is echoed in the tales of British fairies and others, and we can find it in the record of the cunning folks of Wales that this practice continued well into recent times, relatively recent times. And this is true not just in Wales, but also in Scotland and England. So there's an argument that the witch trials never really took off in Wales because the people of Wales would blame the fairies, the spirits, instead of blaming witches. But they'd also go to the people who worked with fairies for help. Maurice Darling writes about this well. Emma Wilby in Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits has a really comprehensive series of accounts, many examples of the medieval British folk, generally poor people who were in need, meeting a fae spirit and having them become an ally. Wilby compares this also to contemporary anthropological accounts of spirit allies in other cultures. So this is a really fascinating book that contextualizes some of the pieces in the story, in the law, in the practices of the cunning folk of this island. Ron Hutton also notes that in Scotland, the realm of fairy was considered hostile to elites, but for ordinary Scots, many retained a belief not merely in the fairy realm, but in its essential benevolence. And this, you can see that little piece there in those two pieces around Tam Lin and Thomas the Rhymer going to the other world, and Tam Lin being very happy there up until that end of the 7 years where he was scared. He'd overheard this. He didn't know that was going to happen, but he'd overheard this, so he was scared. So there's also this thing that folk magicians often reported working with fairies in both Scotland and England, as well as Wales, though our records of this in England are sparser due to the trials focusing on the harm rather than the practices. So as magical practitioners, there's a long history of working with the fair folk as spirits who have magic and who are close enough to our world, or indeed share a large part of it for beneficial magic. The key here seems to be in that compact, like Thomas, keeping your agreements. So as I was exploring all of these pieces and reflecting on my experiences with these beings as I grew up, and the way in which they would turn up for me, I could feel their presence. I occasionally would catch a glimmer. And I've spoken before about how like the visual sense is not a strong point for me in that context, but the sound of the music, the sense, the feeling that they were there, that presence was very strong. And so hearing that they are like the fear around them as being dangerous, I was very confused by that as I grew up. And then I got to this point of realizing that they are beings independent of us, with their own lives, with their own wills. And if you are in good relationship with them, if you treat them as good neighbors, then probably going to be okay. But if you start to take liberties or be entitled, then you may fall into trouble. And if you are a magical person, a person who is somehow fae in that old sense of the word, in that you are seeking out magical knowledge, that you are magical through learning or through nature, either which way, pun not intended, then they may be beings that you can work with. Whereas if you're just dealing with the everyday, then it's going to be much harder. And so, of course, your encounters with them are going to be trickier. So over time, we've evidently had this, and Morgan Daimler mentioned that bit about the impression that we have when we talk about fairies in modern English. Like everyone thinks of fairies, or many people think of fairies, get that impression of them being diminutive, of being like associated with children. Like that was a literary miniaturization. It happened through the literary tradition, through those stories, and through industrialization, making those wilder spaces, the spaces where you can really be in that magical space, where those spirits might live, where you might encounter them. Those spaces got smaller, and as humans moved away from them, and so they became places to avoid rather than places that you'd encounter. So this miniaturization of them actually impacted how seriously the general public took magical practitioners who claimed to have learned from them. And so it seems that their popularity waned in terms of whether or not people claimed that as their source in general conversation in general claims, and things like the court cases around fraudulent mediumship, fraudulent con men doing cunning folk practices as fraudulent things. Like at one point it was really popular for those cons to be rooted in like the claim that they had some kind of connection with the fairies, the fair folk, and that fell out of fashion. And particularly as those beings became more closely associated with children, and specifically girls in the popular imagination, talking about them in a serious occult or magical space became even less fashionable. But I'd suggest that the practice of them working with them never went away. People just stopped talking about it as much in those spaces. There are also descriptions of fairies who were small and dainty as far back as the medieval period, and presumably before. And old folkloric accounts of child-sized fae are very common, so it isn't entirely a Victorian or literary invention. We can also see the continued practice of working with these beings in folkloric paths, in modern traditional witchcraft, in the grimoire spells, calling on the Seven Sisters, for example, and even in the New Age fascination with fairies as spirit beings. The glitz and glamour at festivals that we see very commonly in Britain may even just be another manifestation of their glamour, given that they've never been forgotten. It's one way in which they've been remembered in the popular imagination. And past those sparkles, you might actually find a deep well of magic that these beings hold. If you are the kind of person called through to that kind of space, it is one doorway. The shine of the glitter, the playfulness, the association with children and innocence may in fact also be ways in which we've kept their belief in our modern world, and ways in which we can remember that in order to build that relationship, to connect with them, to work with them, we need to have that openness to learn, that childlike, not childish innocence, not an entitlement, but an openness to be with, rather than try and be in charge of. If you have a look at the fairy census, there's a modern fairy census where people have collected modern day encounters, and there are many accounts of different types of fair folk. Some very much the tall shining ones, some very much the small, more twisted looking beings in the woods, some that are wilder or more dangerous, and some that are more playful and sweet. There's a wide range of encounters and experiences that we put under this banner of fairy, that have come to be under this banner of fairy, of the fair folk. So I recommend that you don't use what I've just said as an excuse to not take them seriously, or to think that I'm trying to say that they're less important than other spirit beings, than ancestral beings. There's this strong connection between the fair folk and the ancestors, and there's this strong connection between human beings and those fair folk beings. There's this kinship somehow, for some reason. And rather than thinking of them as these like tiny things just associated with childhood, it can help to remember that deep innocence and openness in recognizing that we don't know it all can really help. Obviously, there are people who have been brought up working with these beings, but for many of us, like myself, we come to them and have to piece together that old lore, piece together the old paths, and piece together the information that they give us. Learn to listen to how they are guiding us and what they are asking of us. So in Britain, there's long been an emphasis, and in many parts of the world, on rationalization and the intellect. I'm sure some of you can outline the history of where this started to become primacy. But that's only one part of what it means to be human, or what it means to be in relationship. Brian Froud is an amazing fairy artist, and he points out that he describes it to paint fairies is not childish, but it could certainly be said to be childlike in its openness to creative and emotional impulses. So that openness to creative and emotional impulses can be key to tapping into that side of ourselves, which opens the path to meeting the fair folk, if you are that way inclined. So in Britain, I'm very lucky in that the weather here is mostly temperate, the landscape is relatively gentle. The fairy spirits of the land often reflect that, just as the merfolk reflect the danger of the water that surrounds the island. There are many stories of the mermaids that fall in love with or seduce a human, and on either they are like generally speaking, the way that this turns out is that the mortal, the human, decides that they can't go and live in the ocean, and they instead marry a human woman or another human. It's generally a mermaid, but you know, pretty sure this can happen both ways. And in one such story, there was said to be a lad that lived fairly locally to here and to where I live on the west coast of Wales, and he spent many weeks rowing out to meet this mermaid and watch her comb her hair and sing, and fell absolutely head over heels for her. But eventually he does return home and he marries this human lady, and on the eve of his wedding night she visits him, the mermaid visits him and says, if you marry her, then you and she will drown. And he ignores her. And as the bells ring to announce their wedding kiss, their first kiss as newlyweds, the waves rise up and swallow not only the church, not only the newlyweds, but their families, not only that, but the whole village itself. And it is said if you go to that place and you listen carefully on a still day, you can still hear the bell ring beneath the water. Now, I share that with you because it just illustrates that piece that the sea has swallowed up so much of the land. And while on the land, often those spirits that we encounter that are connected to the land, that are somehow related to us and our relationship, somehow interacting with that aspect of things. When it comes to the rivers and the seas, they may well drown you. The will-o'-the-wisp, that connected to the marsh gases, may lead you across into the swamp, into the deep mud and water, and you find yourself lost. So there is this danger there. And there are ways in which these stories remind us of what has happened in this land. So wherever there were mines, you might also find the fairies known as knockers or coblenai. short humanoid beings who mostly stayed out of sight, but would knock to show where the seams of ore could be found, as long as the miners themselves were not mean-spirited and shared their food. They're well attested in Cornwall, but not solely there. Of similar stature are the brownies. You remember I mentioned the undomesticated places. Well, they come and live in the houses, often live in the houses for longer than the people do nowadays, who help out in the homes. And again, as long as the family are respectful and leave food for them. The nature and frequency of food varies depending on the place. Out in the wilderness, these beings roam the woodland and hills. In various places you might find similar descriptions given different names. Pixies and piskies, puka, buki, puck. Seems to me perhaps these names describe their environment and relationship to the way that we see them, hence the names that we've given them, or the names that they've told us to give them, rather than different species per se. So there are some traditional folk protections if you find yourself in trouble. Briefly, and there's lots that can be said about this, but if you find yourself lost and you feel like perhaps you're being misled by a mischievous fey being, turn your coat inside out. If you carry iron, or you place iron over the doorway or over a crib, an iron nail, a horseshoe, iron scissors, they keep them out of reach of babies. That's said to protect from the fair folk that might steal children away. Rowan crosses of rowan twigs, particularly with red thread, or rowan berries, are known to be protection against witchcraft, against negative magic, but also protection against the mischief of fairies. Rowan is also associated with fairies, but we'll leave that to one side. But the main thing is behaving civilly, with respect, and staying out of their way when they're about their business. So, to wrap this up, what are British fairies? Well, they're the fair folk of Britain. They are spirits with their roots in the natural world, spirits of the land and landscape, in the same way we are beings of the land. As fae, they are of magic, as well as the untamed natural world. And as such, it is inevitable that they will take on different forms in different places and in different relationships. Whether in domesticated spaces like the helpful brownies, or the stormy coastline-dwelling mermaid ready to drown the unwary, they are magical beings that are part of our world, even if we've forgotten to pay attention. The other world is part of this world. Just as those beings are tangible, so close to this that they are known to have a smell or various scents, so too is the other world part of this world. But they are, regardless of whether or not you work with them, regardless of what the overculture says, regardless of what certain people will say, just because they've always been said to be being forgotten doesn't mean they are. They are remembered in story, in the stones of the land, in the twisted branches of the lone hawthorn tree, of the offerings of milk and cookies left out on Christmas Eve, even if now we think that they're for Santa, and in the shimmering song that you catch on the edge of the breeze as the sun turns the sky scarlet over the foaming sea, and you hear those bells ring. If you'd like to read more about my work on if you'd like to read more about fairy, my most recent book on it is Folk Tales, Fairies and Spirits, where I break down some of the tales of Northern Europe in order to show some of the keys to working with fairies, but also the process that if you're like me and you're approaching them outside of a family tradition, arguably, though of course my mum always taught me to hug the trees and listen when they spoke. So if you're coming from that process, that place, then how to actually look at the stories, find the stories of your landscape, of your home, and to begin to explore where the keys to the beings that are local to you might live. So Folk Tales, Fairies and Spirits is one that I'd highly recommend, not just because I wrote it, but also because it is, I hope, a way that will give other people space to start making those connections and building right relationship with those beings that we share this world with. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and I hope you stick around for the panel.
Brilliant, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. The meaning of Fae and the connection to magic. Brilliant, loved it. Thank you so much. So if we can get Daniela, I don't want to surprise her in case she's having a cup of tea or something.
I'm
there
here.
You go. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Yes.
Welcome. I see cups of tea. Yeah, I'm missing a
Sure.
cup of tea. I feel a bit left out.
Thank
you. Fascinating information. A lot to process. It's all just wonderful to listen to. We have some really interesting questions. If you are ready, I will get them up on the screen. So interesting one here from Hannah. Have you found in your experience fairies to be more benign than malignant? Short
answer. I mean, so for me, the fairy beings, the fae beings that tend to appear in my life and that I tend to encounter tend to be benign, because that's how I'm approaching, but I avoid the spaces where I'm likely to find the spirits that don't want me there. So if I'm approaching a space and I'm like, oh, hang on a minute, nope, they don't want me in this space, I will back off, or move through as quickly as I can and cause as little disruption as I can. So I mean, those that I have encountered tend to be the ones that want to encounter me. Daniela?
My experience here is, yes, detail to everything you said. I also did encounter those kind of beings who offered to, advise, and but there's always, it was kind of contractual situation where surely giving this to you, but you also have to agree to do this, and that, because if you don't, we're calling the deal out. And also encountered, I mentioned earlier, being the witness and participant actually in a ritual where a baby was about to be like abducted by this fairy being. And some of them are predatory in nature. Not to say they are bad. It's like saying, a hungry shark is not it's not a bad shark, it's a hungry shark. So if you're there and they need that kind of energy or that kind of whatever to feed on, they're going to take it. So this, I wouldn't label that as bad, but predatory nature is something to be aware of when dealing with fairies, and the folklore is very much in support of that. Wherever you go worldwide, what we're talking about, Scandinavian, trolls and those kind of situations, or even elven beings that are more predatory in their attitude toward humans. So it's everywhere. Be polite. Make sure you're on their good side, and something that Quin said, it's very, very wise to do, learn to be in touch with the environment and with this specific fairy presence in mind. When you're tapping into the energy of a place, take note whether you are wanted there or not, and if you get the no, trust your guts, because you're probably right.
Intuition. Good old intuition never lets you down.
Oh yeah.
I'd like to add to what you've just said, actually, and I love that you use the example of the shark, because that's that I live right next to the ocean, so I'm always saying, if you go into fairyland, like you might if you go into the ocean, you might encounter jellyfish who will sting you by accident, or sharks who are hungry, or fish who don't care, or crabs who are just trying to get out of your way. You might encounter dolphins that want to play. Like, you just like, they're beings in their own space. But that question of when you go to a space and you get that sense of, oh no, you're not welcome here. I actually had someone ask me once, it's like, but how do you How do you hear that? No, I'm not welcome here. How do I know what that feels like? Yeah. And what I suggested to them was that they reflected on, because I always work on this very, like, the feeling sense makes a lot of sense to me, but it doesn't to everyone. So I reflected to them and said, look, when you go to a party or you go into a group of people and you get a group of humans and you get the sense that you are not wanted, recognize that, get that feeling and recognize that feeling, and notice when you feel like you are welcome, and begin to, like, pay attention to those two different feelings. And then notice when you get one of those feelings show up when you move into a stone circle, so it's nice and obvious where the boundary is, or a grove, and, like, start practicing feeling for those two different sensations. And then you'll start to be that you'll build that muscle, that skill.
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect.
It does take time, doesn't it, I think, to learn to recognize those feelings, that intuition. Brilliant. So another question, another interesting one from Rosemary. Are elves and gnomes considered to be within the fairy realm? And this one fascinates me. Does the fairy realm have its own pantheon? Not a question I've ever thought of before.
Oh my gosh, I think we all have to contribute to this question, because it's so multi-layered and so faceted that there's not enough points of view to cover it fully. So because I just jumped into the discussion, to give you my 2 cents here, there are, depending, I believe that as many people you would ask about what beings exactly fit under the umbrella fairy, you will get that many answers. So depending what you understand by fairy, if I like to use fairy in this discussion and other similar circumstances as an umbrella term, for the sake of simplicity and clarity, because if I'd start telling, well, and it's the Irish fairy, the is she, and then it's the she, and that's the alfar, but it's also it's Ljosa's alfar and Schwarz alfar, and then that's the zune and the yellow, and okay, so let's put it all,
any of those words.
let's put it all under the umbrella fairy and save like 15 minutes of our discussion time. But you can absolutely, there are people who include what it is called elementals, and what my understanding, my use of elementals would be spirits associated specifically to the elements of fire, earth, what have you, water, what have you. But not all fairies are elementals. You don't put elementals equal fairies, so but the elementals can be seen, in my opinion, as part of the fairy spectrum. Elves, what are we talking about? Ljosalfar, Svaltarfar. Are we talking about the mound elves who are actually connected to the spirit of the dead ones, the ancestors? Are we talking about the very modernized version of house fairies? Elf on the Shelf. I hope nothing falls on my head here. Which came into being, unfortunately. Sorry, I don't like it, because I'm a heathen, so I'm connected to the the alpha and that side of things. And when I hear the Elf on the Shelf thing, I'm cringing. And it's a 21st century invention, but it's spread like wildfire. So what do we understand by fairies in first place? So depending on your understanding, you might place elves like the Scandinavian beings, whether we're talking the human-like, the ones who dwell on also farms, on in the proximity of farms, and have huge influence over the land's fertility and the prosperity of the family owning, dwelling in that farm. So those are very powerful beings, with agency and with power of influencing people's life. So if those are the elves, then yeah, they fit under that umbrella. Whether you're talking about elves more like the modern miniaturized version, put out there like a boys version of little fairies, girls version, kind of to have this gender binary. So if you believe in those, and that's your take on fairies. And by the way, I'm not saying this in a degrading or diminishing way. Fairies are vast in numbers and appearances in types, and I do not deny that there are fairies from insect-like to 7 feet tall beings and everything in between. So whatever your understanding is, if you think of gnomes as spirit of the earth, that's what I mostly think of when I hear the word gnome,
Yeah.
then I would put those under the fairy umbrella, fairy term. As far as fairy realm, we use fairy realm, but actually my understanding of fairy realm, again, Morgan's book, fairy, other world by many other names. I like to think of fairy as I would think of our terrestrial globe, our planet Earth, and continents on it. So fairy would be like the equivalent of the Earth. I don't want to expand it at the scale of the universe, but or solar system, but just think Earth and many continents on it. So that would be like fairy with many sections, divisions, and each continent has countries, but within each country there are regions. You have mountainous region, and you have deep down into the earth, you have mining areas. So every bit of this has its own beings. And yes, they can travel, yes, they can move, but they also have their own places where they may want to return unless they choose to relocate permanently, same as people do. So that's my understanding of the fairy realm. And speaking of their own pantheon, if we were to think of gods and goddesses that have these dual roles as fairy queens as well and kings, and we can think of Anya on the Irish side, who's both solar deity but also a fairy queen. Ondagda, that comes to my mind right now, known in the Irish lore as king of all fairies in Ireland, but who's also seen as a god himself, a powerful Ondagda, the guy who's good at all things. He can do everything. If we think in Norse mythology, Freyr, who's king of Lord of Alfheimr, so he's Lord of the elves in Alfheimr, but he's also a god. He has this dual status of fairy and god. So that's one way of looking at pantheons. My favorite way to look at fairy realm pantheon would be like, what are the gods of fairy? If I were a fairy worshipping gods, or if I were a fairy witch who works outside any pantheons, which I'm not because I'm heathen, but supposedly that I am that, what are the gods above the gods? What are the powers outside that even gods in pantheons and probably fairy themselves honor? So there's work out there, and again I have to point out to Morgan Daimler's work, Living Fairy, where they go into, so it's Living Fairy and also fairy crafting and fairy witchcraft, where they go into detailing these fairy powers, these gods of fairies, this wild forces, wild powers that go not by names but by titles, descriptors, because you can feel them, you can sense them, and they're huge and they're both scary and alluring, and it's hard to resist. I used to experience those as a child and never ever have a word for it, and really got tired in my search. And zillion years later, I grab Morgan's book and I'm like, so literally that was my reaction. I'm like, wait a minute, somebody actually has a vocabulary for that. So if that was the question, I certainly relate with that aspect. Rachel, hello Queen, what can you add to this? I want to learn more. I want to learn more because
yeah, I love what you're saying. So like, and that piece, so I often describe like the fairy realm, the fairy otherworld, the, you know, Elfheim and what have you. Like, so for many years I was trying to like pick apart an understanding, as I say, philosopher, and go like, what am I feeling and how does that fit in with what other people are telling me? How do I understand this? and so like it's not that their globe, their Earth is somewhere else, but that it is also here. Yeah. And so actually, like the only language that I really have to describe it that makes sense is using the language of frequencies. And so it's like we've got the physical, like really tangible Earth at this sort of dense frequency where we are, and that there are all these other Earths that are all those other layers. So like if you want to talk about it in very human terms, we've got kind of the emotional frequency and the mental frequency and the spirit frequency. Like we can use that, we can use the elemental, like the earth frequency, the water frequency, the so on. But there are these different frequencies that are all in the same place, all interpenetrating, and we can feel it in ourselves. We've got our physical body, and then we've got like our emotional and energetic and our mental like aspects all in the same place. And so the fairy realm to me feels like it's a range of frequencies in that, using that language, that overlap with our physical world, but is also bigger and deeper than it. It sort of overlaps with, and I think that's why we end up with the intersection, our ancestors and ancestral spirits in the same realm when we go into that energetic space. But also why I think that's why they're one of the reasons they're so close to us, is because we share a lot of space in that spectrum. So the fairy realm, I don't think is something that is somewhere over there, but as you say, has all of those different places, those different continents. I love this question, does the fairy realm have its own pantheon? And I understood it to be like, do the fairies worship beings that are bigger than them? Well, the question there for me is like, well, what is a god to a human? Because that relationship of a human to a god then tells us what we think of as being gods. What is a pantheon to a human? That then tells us what relationship are we looking for the fairies to have, like to illustrate those spirits. And I'm like, I absolutely believe that they do. And it feels like that like the way you were describing it, the powers that move through things that we can also encounter, definitely 100%. They're just not as human as we consider the gods to be, generally speaking. Yeah, like that makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm like, yeah, I mean, probably, but would they call it, or would they describe it in the same terms? How would they approach it? And now I want to go and ask my fairy allies. I'm like, so can we have a conversation about this? Can we get into some fairy theology?
I did have this conversation, and I got like tidbits, like bits and pieces, given, because sometimes you have, I mean, they give you the information, but you have to piece it together. And I can only speak about my particular situation. So first, I really, really love that aspect that you highlighted, that intersectionality in between our worlds and there, because I mean, I gave the example of an earth, but notice it's not an earth out there. It's actually an earth surrounding and interpenetrating our own world. And this is why we have the slips, they coming over here, us going over there, more or less intentionally, but it does happen. And about the pantheons and the gods above the gods, tidbits that I can share, because sometimes you can, sometimes you're like, you don't talk about these things with other people until you get more clarity about it yourself. So there are, for example, there is an entity, like a super huge energy that I call her the spinning goddess, or the great spinner, or something like that. And energy is very pervasive, and you cannot really put, the spinner equals, I don't know, Arachne in Greek mythology, or she equals Frigg in Norse pantheon. She is her energy. She, as this big, vast, incomprehensible thing, can be seen as speaking through Frigg, manifesting as Arachne, Freya through her connection with magic, because magic in Norse tradition involves a lot of spinning as well, Seder, and yeah, so it's not about putting an equal sign, but this power can inform many other deities, or can be seen in many other deities that are there, each deity being its own entity, separate of, it's not like, oh, everybody's the face of the goddess or everybody's the face of the god. So there, it's like, a mother's DNA would appear in each of her children. The children are not the mother, but the DNA has been shared, and something of the mother's personality appears somehow, is carried on into the children. Kind of not exact description, but that's the closest that I had to my mind.
I've tried to articulate this sort of thing over the years, and putting it in the context of like being the gods of the fae folk I love. And it's that, like, trying to explain how Freya can be a fairy queen and Rhiannon can be a fairy queen, and they're not both faces of the fairy queen, and the fairy queen isn't just an archetype, but a power in her own right.
Yes.
I think our language is so limited with this, but one of the things that you're talking about, the mother's DNA, and I often go back to, so every teacher is a teacher in their own right and takes on the role of teacher, but there's also the power, the magic of teaching that is in and of itself something.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm loving this conversation. I'm so excited.
Me too. I mean, we can go on for, let me just get more tea, and we can be there for the rest
It's a fascinating question. I had never thought about a pantheon for the fairies. It's a fascinating question. Well done, Rosemary. Good question. She's suggesting now that you do need to pick their brains because she'd like a book written on it. So if you could just get on that, that'd be good.
Sure, absolutely.
Now, something that I know we was touched on, but another question here. Do you think fairies have evolved in such a way there are now urban fairies who are different to traditional fairies? And for me, I think this is about appearances as well. Are we likely to bump into a fairy in their jeans at a rock concert? I mean, rather than the kind of archetype that we think of.
I'm Nancy. Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
So
we got plenty of time. You keep going.
Good. So this is the question that I was actually pondering over yesterday, when somehow I came into a discussion about mythical time. And by mythical time is understood in my discussion in that context, a time that's like frozen still. And whenever we interact with gods or with fairy beings, fairy queens, they would appear to us and interact with us from that mythical time, meaning that they preserve their appearance and everything as they were back then. And I believe that's a possibility because the human mind is very, very, very multifaceted, and we may tune into gods or fairies or what have you through different channels, and that would shape our interaction and would give expression to what we are seeing or hearing or sensing from across. But on the other hand, both from my own experience, and I'll just put a pin on that because I'll get back to it. From my own experience and from what I was told by my own beings, there is an essence there it is immutable. But it's not forever. If you look at the fairy lore and the folklore, fairy themselves, they live unfathomable long lives, but nevertheless, they die at some point. And we're going to see this with gods as well. So thousands of years, they die and they morph into something else. They come out, different forms, people worshiping them in different ways with a different understanding. And even if the way they look are vestigial and still resemble to some deity from 10,000 years ago, they are nevertheless a new person, a new being. And I think this applies to fairies as well. They do evolve. These are same as practices. These are not things fossilized to be put under, in a case, and we look at them, oh, they're beautiful, and then try to engage with them in the same way. which would make it impossible. I mean, why do I have to use, it's beautiful to look at, let's say a stone axe, it's something beautiful to look at, but if for practical reasons I have to use an axe, I'd rather get the best steel on the market and the best balance so I can chop whatever I need to chop instead of using. So it's practicality as well as the fact, undeniable, that things move in a certain direction and nothing is stagnant. How can possibly fairy that is so much not unstable, but such a flowy, ever-changing energy, how can that be reflected into a fixed set mold that does not change over hundreds of years? So I believe they change. I believe because they're shapeshifters, I believe they can present themselves in a way that we can recognize them from their stories. And since their stories are very old, we may get a perception of them as contemporary to the time the stories were born or circulating more widely. But if we look at the folklore, we see fairies appearing, people encountering fairies, and they cannot really tell they're dealing with a fairy because they're dressed the same way, they have the same concerns. There's the Irish stories where, fairy being comes and asks to borrow some flour or some milk because she has children to feed, and it so happens that her pantry is empty. So kind of same concerns, which shows actually what Hello was saying earlier, how close our worlds are, how closely interconnected we are. So yeah, I believe the whole spectrum of possibility is possible. Apologies for that. I think all possibilities are out for the taking, from seeing fairies in medieval garb to seeing fairies in jeans and t-shirts and maybe carrying backpacks with supposedly laptops inside. If I am to connect with one of my spirit guides for business purposes, I'm pretty sure he will appear maybe closer to something that I expect him to be, like dressed for a business situation rather than medieval armor and sword in hand. So my take.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, the short answer is yes. In that some will still appear in the old ways, in older appearing ways, but yes, there are definitely urban fairies. And as I mentioned, like I grew up in Swindon, which is a very fast growing, it's nowadays quite a rough town, but it's quite large, it's very urban, and I couldn't drive, so I would spend I just walked everywhere, so I would just walk through the streets of Swindon, and okay, there are the trees, and you look up and you can see the sky, so there's still those aspects of nature there. But when there were lots of humans around, it was less likely. But while I was wandering through that space, periodically I would feel those spirits there, those beings there. I would notice them. And I remember going to Nottingham, of all places, which is a big city, and going to Rock City, so a rock club, very urban space. And if any of you know Gary Newman's music, it was a Gary Newman concert. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I was there in my long black leather trench coat. Me and my partner were the youngest people in the room, but I was dressed very appropriately. And I remember the music was I mean, the performance was amazing. He stepped onto the stage and you could feel the glamour. You could feel the enchantment coming off him. Some performers don't do that, but he definitely did. And I at some point during that gig, I looked up and I swear I could see fairy beings having doing their own thing. They were not interested in what the dancers were doing. They were there for the gig or for something. They may have been feeding on the energy, they may have just been hanging out, they might have just been enjoying someone who was good at their magical music, but they were there. And in very, very similar to the way that I would find those beings in the hedgerow.
Right.
It was fascinating. And I was like, oh, okay, right. And it was such a visceral experience for me. I'm like, yeah, okay, these beings that are part of this world. And one of the things that I always come back to is that we think of ourselves as being somehow separate from nature. We think of ourselves as being separate from the land and separate from this earth, but we are not. We are animals just like any other. And we are animals with a great deal of control over our environment. And that's what we've done. We've shaped our environments in ways that sort of more or less suit us and that make our lives comfortable. And I'm very, very grateful for the amount of comfort that I have as a result of that. But we're not separate from the world, and we're not separate from the landscape and the nature that is that home of the fair folk, of the spirit world. And so while we've been shaping the world, they've been shaping the world alongside us. And you know, just as much as we laid the hedges and shaped the hedges, just as much as the birds make their nests, like lots of creatures, lots of beings shape the landscape. The urban centres are just very obviously human shaped. But there's one piece in there that is, if you think about how much influence the fair folk have had over humanity, and how often we have, as creatives, as musicians, perhaps as architects, as gardeners, as builders, people who work with their hands shaping the physical environment. And musicians are a really obvious one folklorically. But if you think about the masons and their connections with magical orders and that connection with that spirit world, like it would seem weird to me to not say that there are, that like it would be weird to deny that there are these beings that we would fit under the banner of fairy if we really thought about it, that have had a hand in that and had a space in that, and will hopefully have helped shape the space to keep space for them where we've forgotten that we should be keeping space for them.
The Gary Newman thing, the gig thing fits though, doesn't it? Because fairy do love music.
Oh yeah.
So to be drawn, I mean, we have so much music in the world, to be drawn to that makes sense.
Yeah. One of the challenges, I think, is that we can get really distracted. So we stop paying attention. And when there's lots of noise and lots of music or lots of electronics, like the hum of electricity drowns out some of the more sensitive, the more subtle energies from our perspective. But that doesn't mean that they're not there.
Excellent. I love the idea of them being a Gary Newman gig. That's perfect. So we have a couple more questions. Let me always one from Scott. Do any of the panel see the fairy the same or related to pixies? You did touch on pixies earlier, didn't you? Both I understand as earth spirits, born of the earth, and both benevolent and mischievous where humans are concerned. So Scott lives in Portland, which is in Dorset in England. I've never heard of these nanny dement pixies. Has anyone come across them before? They are very similar to Daniela's Romanian fairies. Pixies I've heard of, obviously, but the nanny dement pixies, I like that name. Never heard.
Yeah, there are lots of very specifically regional names that are attached to pixies. So like and pixie is quite a common term for like the southwest of England, for Cornwall, Devon. Yeah. But it's come into general language. Like if you say pixie to people, most people will know that, like have an idea. And this is one of the examples where like the Cornish pixies or piskies are often depicted as small, like quite small beings. so I mean, like, yeah, I would absolutely categorize pixies as being part of that umbrella category of fairies. And I love what you're saying here, that they're like, that you understand the pixies as earth spirits, and both benevolent and mischievous as far as we're concerned. Like, it's always, when we're talking about all these things, it's from our perspective more often than not. And actually, it would be very difficult for us to speak to and from their perspective, even if they've communicated it to us, because we're going to try and put it into human language that other humans can understand, and that will, so yeah, the short answer to that is I haven't come across that particular type of pixie before, but yes, I would consider them to be the same. Daniela?
Do you agree? Yeah, Daniel?
Oh, I was just thinking about how pixies, the little that I know about pixies, because obviously unfortunately I've never made it to England, but it's on my list. So I'm so curious, how would I connect, with the land, and with land spirits and everything that's in there. It's on my list, seriously. But about the parallels with the Romanian fairies, I see that as that balance, or that dual nature, fluctuating between mischievous and benevolent. When you're in their good graces, they're nice. When they're not, and of course the degree of unpredictability, sometimes, like, what happened, we were friends up to 3 seconds ago, and now I have this thing, dumped on me or happening to me, and I know who's behind it. So in that regard, I see the pixie Romanian fairy plus the relationship with the earth. Yes, the connection to the earth and to the landscape. I'm not sure. I didn't mention, in Romania we have two. We also have the mine fairies that you mentioned. So we have those as well. In terms of how they look, if I don't know how you experience or what you have to say about the way pixies look, but my understanding, like, pixies being a little bit on the shorter side of the spectrum in terms of height, these would be similar to the mine dwellers in Romania, who are described like on the shorter sides, also very benevolent towards some of the miners, those who are not greedy, and really, really outright decided to kill the other guys who are abusing the mines, the resources, or who are not giving offerings to the mine fairies. So is that anything that's pixie-ish as well?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So much of the stories and so much of the experiences that you've described, that I've had, that other people have said, so much of it is about, like, not being entitled and being respectful.
Oh, yeah.
And being in relationship. I believe that, like, there's a relationship in the folklore between the pixies and the knockers, or the
Mine.
like the mine beings. There's lots of different names for them, in that they're both considered to be of the same kind of family, in terms of being fairies, or fair folk. They're both types of fairy, but I don't know how often people would say they're the same being, just in different places.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say the same being, but yeah, just exactly what you said. So that's my feeling. They're kind of the same family.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
There's a really interesting thing that I came across recently, which I'd not read before, and I can't remember where I read it now. And it was about pixies in particular, and that there was a particular piece of a particular type of pixie that was known, like, they can change shape, right? So they can shapeshift. Absolutely right. That's fine. Knew that. But there's a particular type of pixie that is said to every time it changes its shape, it gets a little bit smaller.
Oh,
And so there's a finite amount of times. And I just love that as a story. I don't, like finite amount of times, because every time they'd start out about 3 foot tall, and then every time they change shape, they end up a little bit smaller. A little bit, yeah.
I've heard about this, if memory serves, in connection with, I think it's Scottish, where a witch can turn, Scottish or Irish, where a witch can turn into a cat, but it can only do so 9 times. If for the 9th transformation, if she uses that 9th chance opportunity to transform in a cat, then she's bound to remain a cat. She cannot flip back. So it's a limited. I have no recollection as of where I read it. That's one of the problems when you read so many things, tons of the book. Where does it come from? So we don't know, but it's there. So yeah, makes sense. I mean,
I wonder what that limitation, like where that comes from in terms of the metaphysical side of it. Like, what is that showing us? It's like the 7-year time limit on the humans in fairyland, or like there's always a limit on the time that, or almost always a limit on the time that the fairy wives, more often than not, come to the human realm before they have to return. Like, I wonder what that metaphysics is. Anyway.
I don't have a direct answer to that, but I mean, let me pour gasoline on fire, right? And to give you more food for thought. I mean,
go for it.
Because why not? So I had this discussion with one of my alpha beings and asked, okay, I saw you manifesting in like corporeal form on at least 2 occasions, one of which is described in the book. No, 2 of them are already in the book, but there were more. And I'm like, why this doesn't happen more often? I mean, come on, you can be corporeal, you can be incorporeal. Can you imagine what an impression you would make and switch all of it, completely the point, this would be the tipping point where everybody would say, oh yeah, they exist, they can be corporeal, and why don't you do it? And the answer was like, you little entitled prick. That would have been me. How do you dare? First of all, who do you think cares whether among us, whether you human beings believe or don't believe, or take us or don't take us, consider our corporeality, it's being real or not? We really don't care about it. We have nothing to prove. And second, does it occur to you that in those circumstances when we manifest, it's either by accident, therefore we are doing something that was really, really relevant for us and had every single reason to assume a corporeal form, but that was not for us to put it on display for you. You just happen to peak in a time and moment that you shouldn't anyway. And the other thing is, when we take form, do you realize the amount of energy that it takes for us to decompose and recompose, reassemble, to cross this boundary in between dimensions? And parenthesis, modern physics, quantum physics. I'm not a physicist, therefore I'm not gonna, but it looks that they are coming up with more and more possibilities in terms of more dimensions of the space and the possibility of entanglement and connection between worlds that until recently was really the realm of fantasy. Well, turns out it's not. So I was given by my fairy guide first the scolding, and then being told it takes tremendous energy for us, to manifest. And second, we have to have a really good reason for it to happen. It's either supported by a very substantial offering that's worth the effort and the sacrifice, because it's a sacrifice. Each time this happens, it takes a toll on us. So that would be like what your hello was saying before. It's limited by something. I don't know what it is, but I get to see more of that. It's limited by something.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Actually, Daniela, you mentioned it earlier, and it was one of the questions I asked beforehand for anyone had any questions, and I've got a few of those. can fairies die?
If we look into folklore, we have descriptions of fairy fighting on battlefields, people witnessing actually encounters and battles among fairies, and that's, I've heard it in Romanian lore, I've heard it from Irish lore, and as a consequence, fairies dying. They have unfathomable long lives, but they can die and they can be killed. Various ways to kill them. They can kill one another. They have their own weapons, their own ways of taking the life of another fairy. It looks like iron can inflict mortal wounds, life-ending wounds on a fairy being. And if we look again, mentioned earlier, even in mythology, we're being told about gods dying, and whether we assume this to be like a teaching tale and to be shown that certain processes or things come to an end, everything has an ending, or it comes to the really dying in terms of a god dying to make place to another deity to replace it. This holds true in a different paradigm for fairy beings. We have fairy monarchs who at some point they die and other fairy monarchs replace them. And it's just part of that change and continuum and things moving as time goes on. So yeah, same as a human life cycle, but just on a different scale, an unfathomable scale for us to grasp. But yes, they're dying. So there are many stories of fairy dyings. We hear fairy lovers dying from grief.
Okay.
So from just a broken heart. So they die from physical wounds, from emotional collapse, same as some of us can and unfortunately do.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Looking at another question that I had. So, I had a question about someone that was dreaming about fairy. A couple of fairy appeared in their dream, apparently, as children, but she didn't feel that they were really children. You're both going, oh yeah. But they were mocking her, apparently, and making fun. It sounds like you've heard this story before. She wants to know what to do about it. How does she know if they want her to do something, or is it just that they were having a bit of fun and, you know, what should she do, really?
Oh gosh, I have a bunch of thoughts. So in my book, in A Fairy Path, I'm actually detailing my encounter with a fairy being, and it was like corporeal, and it was like nerve-wracking and really shattering, but it was very interesting, and I wanted more of that later on because why not? And she appeared as a child, and in the beginning I didn't pay attention, so started to chase her, and she started to run toward the woods, and I was chasing her, but there was something. And you know, when you're a kid, you don't pay attention. It's an opportunity to play. You go and play. I mean, you're 9 years old and you're enjoying, you know, you just saw a girl like myself and I wanted to play. But then in retrospect, it's like, what's odd about this being? What is odd? And I realized that was something about her eyes. The eyes were not the eyes of a child. So her eyes were different. So brown eyes, brown hair, but her eyes were not. And the way she was talking, yes, the voice was that of a child, of a 9, 10 years old. But the words and the way she was, that was not of a kid, really. I mean, I can read since I was 3. I was considered like above my age, blah, blah. That child was levels above. So very, very mature in the way she talked. So that was one thing. And we cross paths. I mean, we cross paths again, her appearing as a child a number of times in a span of probably 18 months or 2 years. But then I did something stupid and chased her away. I mean, she's like, I don't have anything to do with you, you stupid, you know, human. I'll talk to you when you'll, you know, come to your senses. So she appeared like 25 years later, which for her was nothing. But when she appeared as a full-grown person that had something familiar, but I didn't recognize her. Now, if I'm to put this in fairy time on a fairy scale, she could have not possibly grown from a 10 years old to a 30-ish, 40-ish years old in such a short span. So that obviously when she appeared as a child, it was not a child. She took the form of a child. And that she asked, after I recognized finally the eyes, and it was a catchphrase that she gave me. And I'm like, oh, that's you. Why didn't you appear like this back then? And she's like, yeah, right. As a kid, if I would have appeared like out of the blue, like a grown-up person in front of you and tell you, hey, come with me in the woods, would you have really followed?
Yeah.
So yes, they can appear as children when they have an interest, when they're trying to communicate, a message. So I would suggest dissect, the dream, go and do analysis, what was said, what was told, what was happening in your life then, because this can be some advice, can be something. And I do not communicate often with them in dreams. It's rare. But I know of people who have their main line of communication with fairies via dreams. So, Halo, I don't know what's your experience with that. Probably plenty. Maybe you can tell me more about dreams.
No. So my one of my the interesting things that I have when I dream of spirit beings and of deities and of that ilk and the fairy queen is a very good example of this, is that they appear to me as places rather than people.
Okay.
So I've had like specific sets of beings that I've gone to meet through my dreams, like deliberately asked to meet them, and I found myself exploring buildings and going, this is weird, I wonder if I'll find that spirit here. And then I slowly realize, oh no, wait, the location is them.
Right.
And at that point, I generally encounter someone who like belongs to the place. Like, so if it was a garden, there might be a gardener. In a hotel, there was a butler, sort of. So that are kind of that speak for them, but aren't them. They're kind of like the secretary almost. And so my experience of the fair folk in dreams, I went looking for the fairy queen, and she turns up as a wild, absolutely massive river. For me, that's how she turns up. And it's like consistent to the point that when a river turns up in my dreams, I'll reflect on it in the morning and go, oh, was there also this sense of recognition, the energetic thing that means I'm like, this river also has this component. When I meet her in like magical workings, no, she comes through generally, not always, but generally in more anthropomorphic forms. So the short answer is like that aspect of interacting with like the fae in child forms in dreams, like what you said sounds like really sensible advice. My other thing would be that if you believe that if you're like, did this spirit come here to communicate something with me? Do they want something of me? Or are they here to share something with me? Then the next step, like look at your dream, interpret that to see if you can get the answers from it. But the next step would be then to ask them, and actually ask, like make space somehow to ask them. You might have a divination system that you use, like tarot or runes or similar. You might incubate a dream if that's a good way of communicating for you. So take that time. You might go into meditation. You might do a journey to go and meet them. The thing with all of that is to make sure that you put in place whatever your safety measures are so that you feel secure. If you have a guide or a guardian spirit, because if you don't know who it is that you're encountering, it's really good to take precautions, and ask for that ask those your allies. But the other piece about it is that if you get that message from them that they want something from you or they have something for you, then just make sure that you are really, really clear that what it is that they are asking, whether or not it is actually something that you are willing and able to give. And if they are offering you something, it's like, well, what is it that they are needing in return? So actually, like, get really clear on what the compact, the agreement is before you agree to it. Because even if it sounds really easy, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be. So yeah.
Is it likely to be a trap, basically?
I mean, like, and that's the thing. If you don't know who the spirit is, you don't know if it's likely to be a trap or a trick, or if it's likely to be friendly and helpful. You just don't know. So, you know, respectfully, like, spend a bit of time and just navigate that, and don't agree to anything that you're not comfortable with. And this is one of the things that, like, for most people, if a spirit turns up or a deity turns up or one of the fair folk turn up and they're like, we want you to do such and such, you can say no. Not everyone can, but for most people you absolutely can. Or not everyone can without consequence, but most people can. Most people can. So, you know, if you're not comfortable, yeah, just you know, make sure that there's clarity, as much clarity as you can, and then you make your choice, and it's your choice.
Excellent advice. So we've got literally a couple of minutes left. If someone wanted to start working with the world of fairy, any advice, warnings? How do you suggest people start with it?
Can I go briefly? I just had this discussion recently, and it was about, okay, I really, really feel this call, you know, working with the elves. And I'm like, why? So if you're really getting, my suggestion would be, if you're really, really getting, oh my gosh, I want to start working with fairy, partnerships with fairy. Is this dictated by the fact that we're just watching Lord of the Rings, you know, the Rings of Power, and we have this idea about what elves and fairy beings and otherworldly being? Is it a specific mythology or story body that calls to us and would really, really like to bring a degree of that into our lives? So what exactly is the motivation? Is this the desire to connect more with the land? Now, not all fairies are spirits of the land, but nevertheless, all of them have one or another, one way or another, they have fingers into the relationship with the land, this pie represented by relationship with the land and landscape nature. So what is the motivation? And based on that motivation, if you sit for that for long enough, you may figure out that it's a curiosity, or you really have been called, and all the little incidents and instances that you're presenting these fairy things were to actually get you into taking active steps towards engaging. Now, when you start to work with fairies or alongside fairies, let's say that you are on a quest for, building a relationship, bringing more of them and their lore and their their presence into our super industrialized, super technologized world, and you want more of that to facilitate that return, if you will. Then first of all, read the lore and the folklore. I would start from there and recognize what is happening around you, whether it is or it isn't related to fairies themselves as being, maybe this other type of being, maybe that's deity of sorts that want to interact with you, not necessarily fairy. So sometimes signals come from their side toward ours. Sometimes it's us opening up, okay, I'm curious about this and I want to explore it. And I would say start by reading as much as you can. Who are the beings of your own location, where you dwell in the moment, and then how is that represented in your culture of origin, because you have to find points of contingency in between the two. So speaking from my own experience here. So the land that I'm on and where I come from and where I actually ended up, with elves and, the Alfar and all of those. And then each body of lore, each tradition will have warnings about what not to do, what is inappropriate to do. Like in every culture you go, some things are not to be done in public. They're like no.
Right.
And some other things are appropriate. In the same way, read, learn, talk to people who are native of the cultures that you are interested in connecting with. For example, I have a crush on Irish fairies and the fairy lore and the beings of there. So I talk to native people and learn from them. And Morgan, of course, how can I, interact in a way that's respectful and I'm not overstepping? So talking to native people and read all the folklore, go for sources that are more traditional. There's value in modern sources as well, but it has to be a balance, balance views. And learn what not to do if there's a mounting body of evidence that it's not good to be in a certain place at a certain time. Maybe don't go there. And if you're like myself, yeah, but I'm still curious about it. If you decide to go there, do what Halo suggested. Make sure that you have your fairy guides and all of the apotropaics that you can possibly carry in your pockets with you, and be equipped. Have an exit plan in case things, know when to pull the plug when things go south.
Yeah,
And
I'm so totally with you on that. It's that read the stories, read the folklore, listen to the people. And this is one of the wonderful things about this particular thread of magical working, is that if it is something that interests you, if it is something that calls to you, you can talk to people about the fairy stories and the stories about fairies without actually saying, so how are you supposed to work with them? You can go and ask, like, what are the stories?
Yeah.
You can read the old accounts in your locale. And as Daniela says, it's that, like, the different locations have different rules, different customs, different spirits, different beings. It's going to be different where you are. There will be a lot of similarities. There is a lot of overlap in the different places, and the similarities can sometimes be more obvious than the differences, but it's those folk tales can be where you find the nuances. So make sure you are looking specifically as local as you can and talking to the old people there, because the old people there know the stories. The other thing to do is, if you can't go and talk to the human people, go and find a tree that is happy for you to sit with them, and sit under a tree or a stone that feels like it is welcoming, and go and listen to the land, listen to the trees, listen to the stones. If you can combine the two, you go and you sit and you listen and you read. Like, I used to love reading aloud fairy poetry under the trees, and I'd read them as an offering. So I take a poem that I felt like a really good way of being in relationship with them, that I really loved, that was about them, and painting them in a really beautiful light. And I'd go and I'd sit in the cemetery, because that was where all the old trees were, and I'd read to them. And then I would put the book down and I would listen and feel. And then after a little bit of time, because I get restless, I'd sit and start, like, journaling and writing and what I was receiving, and they'd hang out with me. So that can be a really nice way of introducing yourself to those spirits of your place. And if you can't actually get outside and out into, like, natural spaces, if you can sit on your doorstep and look up at the sky and breathe in that, because, like, some of us, obviously some of us are very disabled, and getting out into even a park is hard. But if you can get on your doorstep or sit in an open window and breathe in that air and tell stories or sing a song to the wind, like, that is a starting place. And then listen to the wind and see what happens.
Fabulous. That's
So
a perfect way to end. Listen to the wind. Very poetic ending. It has been an absolutely fascinating time chatting with you ladies. The knowledge is phenomenal. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully everyone has enjoyed it too. I'm sure they have. It will be on replay for anyone that missed the beginning of it. Do have a look at the Moon Books website for books by these lovely ladies, and enjoy your fairy journeys. Thank you for joining us. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.